Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Soulcast Media live event. It is so fantastic seeing you all. We have over 150 of you live dialing in from all over the world. Oh my goodness, it's fantastic. Continue putting into the chat function where you all are dialing in from. This is one of the reasons why I love putting on an event like this because, because it's virtual, we really can have we have folks from India, Saudi Arabia, here in California, Malaysia, France. Oh my goodness. Yeah, keep letting us know where you're from. So whether it's your morning, your evening, your afternoon, I just want to say how glad that you're here. This is a very special event. We're going to be talking all about harnessing the power of emotions at work. And what I love about this topic is it's probably not something we think about, like emotions, work. Does it help us? Does it hurt us? So there's so many questions that I'm really eager to ask my guest, who I'm going to introduce in just a little bit. But before we get started, really quickly, does everybody hear me and can see me okay? Because we're virtual, sometimes with the tech stuff, you just never know. So just give me a thumbs up on your end so I know all of that is working fine. So if this is the first time you're joining, my name is Jessica Chen, and I'm the founder and CEO of Soulcast Media. And we are a communications training company, meaning we focus on helping folks level up their communication skills, whether it's through one of my many e-courses on LinkedIn Learning, or it's through coming in and partnering with organizations where we host workshops. We also do a lot of speaker series, just coming in and helping people improve their communications. It's what I'm passionate about. One of the reasons why I started Soulcast Media was because when I first started working, which was actually in news, I was a journalist for about 10 years. Communications was not something I was good at. I consider myself fairly shy and introverted and timid. And as you can imagine, when you work in media, you have to be really loud and sometimes even almost very aggressive. And I remember when I started, when I was 20, 21 years old, it felt like almost like a shock. Like a lot of the things that I was taught of oh, yeah, just work hard, you'll be fine. It seemed like there were so many other skills in work that I just didn't realize I needed to know how to do well, one of it being communications. So after about 10 years, I was like, wait a second, I learned a lot working on the news and in media that I now wanted to teach professionals. So this is why we're here. And I put on an event like this, Soulcast Media Live, about every other week or so, because it's just an opportunity for me to see you, me to meet you, but for you to all think about communication skills, career, and just other ways to accelerate your career. So this is why we're here. And we're going to be talking all about harnessing the power of emotion. So without further ado, I'm excited to invite my guest up. And I just want to say this chat, it's a conversation between me and Liz, but it's also an opportunity for you to ask us any questions that you may have. So please continue to use the chat function, put in questions. I'll do my best to try to answer it. Or if there's something that Liz and I said, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's an interesting point, feel free to drop it into the chat as well. So, my guest is Liz, and she is an author of two best-selling books all about feelings. The first one is called No Hard Feelings, and the other book is called Big Feelings. So, when we're thinking about how do we navigate our emotions at work, how does it show up? Is it good? Is it bad? I think Liz is the expert. So, Liz, I'm so excited to have you. I think you're still on mute, so if you want to unmute yourself, we'd love to say hi, Liz.
Hi. Yes, key to communications is not being on mute.
This
Tip
is
number
true.
one.
This is true. I think back to early COVID days when all of us were still getting used to
Yeah.
Zoom or Teams, and it's like, "You're on mute." Even I feel like there was a
I'm
lot of
still doing it apparently. But yeah, it's so great to be here and so exciting that there's so many people joining from all over the world. Welcome, everyone.
Yes, it's so great. We have over 170 people here right now who are eager to learn. So, Liz, I did a quick intro of who you are, but I'd love to hear, who are you, the work that you do, and even just how did you get started talking about feelings in the workplace?
Yeah, so like you said, I've written two books on emotions at work, and I often advise leaders and teams on how to effectively embrace emotions in the workplace. And that takes many forms. So it can take how do you communicate effectively? How do you become an emotionally fluent leader? So someone who shows up authentically, but without overburdening your team or oversharing, which can undermine your authority. And lately have been talking a lot about navigating uncertainty successfully. The way that I came to this work, I like to think, hopefully, that I'm good at talking about emotions at work now because I used to be very bad at it. So, for context, I'm in the US. My parents immigrated here from Northern Europe. They are very stoic people. They also very much, they, for example, didn't know what therapy was until I told them when I was in my mid 20s. So, I think it was that kind of environment that I grew up in. And they also, my mom had me when she was 44. My dad was in his early 50s. So there was a big generational gap. I'm an only child. I think there was a lot that kind of fed into basically me having a very emotionally repressed childhood. And I entered the workforce with this deep seated belief from them that to be professional, especially as a woman, you don't fail, you don't fuss, and you certainly never feel. And that was the sort of the way that I conducted myself in my first job. And about 2 years into that job, I completely burnt out. I was getting debilitating migraines. I had to quit. I had no idea what I wanted to do next. And that really, this had been kind of my dream job. It checked all the immigrant parent, things like went into a high building, made a good salary. Like I could have been there for 50 years if I wanted to. I wore a suit from Banana Republic every day. Like it just felt very, like, oh, I made it in the world. Um, and I think that really caused me to reflect on both why was this job not suited to me? But then also what could I have done differently to maybe make more of the experience so that it wouldn't have ended so catastrophically, essentially. And what I found, I didn't know things like if you suppress all your emotions, you never tap into the parts of your job that you like, even if it's not the right job. Usually you can figure out, oh, I do actually like these projects. And that might be an indicator of what I want to do next. Maybe I can grow and learn in this space within this job still. I had not really formed deep connections with my coworkers. I didn't know that your manager could be a mentor to you. I was very reactive, very closed off. And so that really was what led me to start exploring what does it mean to let emotions in or even just admit that we have them? And what does that look like? Especially, I was in consulting, so it was more of a traditional environment. So, really being cognizant of the fact that, you know, embracing your emotions doesn't necessarily mean that you're a feelings fire hose and you're going to say everything you're feeling to every single person that you work with. But there are some things you can do to just enjoy your work life more.
Oh my goodness, Liz. You just shared something that I I have so many thoughts on, and it kind of goes back to a lot of the work that I do, which is communications. So Liz and I actually we work with the same publisher. My book is coming out this summer, but in my book, I talk so much about how the way we were raised affects how we show up in the workplace. And your story, Liz, of growing up in a home where perhaps your parents were a bit or very stoic, like not showing too much emotions. In my mind, I'm like, I grew up in a conservative Asian family. And even though it might have been like, two different families, but I think, like, I completely resonate with that. Like, I remember growing up similarly. It wasn't about showing emotions even at home. It's like you gotta, like, get it together. Like, I remember even things like crying or fussing, right? It would be immediately like, "No, that is not okay," right? And in some ways, like, I have a son too. I'm always thinking about like, okay, how do I manage his emotions? Because it's not like I want to repress them. Like I feel like emotions are part of us. But I remember feeling that because I held and put and just kept so much in my heart, a lot of the times that when I went into the working world, it was this like confusion. I call it sometimes this like culture shock in the workplace where you're like, whoa, like you see sometimes your colleagues who are just like super emotional, but in a good way, right? Very excited and very like enthusiastic. And I'm like, I would think, is that professional? Like, can I do that? Because I was always taught you got to be like very like straight edge, just like yes, no, like there's no like kind of gray in between. By the way, I don't know if anybody has ever like, or does anybody resonate with that? Because Liz, when you're saying that, I was like, that was me too. And how much of our childhood affects the way we show up. And I think as we all, go through the years of working, we kind of like, find our style, find our voice. But a lot of it is like learning on the spot. And I think for you, Liz, you're saying like you burned out a little bit. And I think for me, it was certainly so hard, and I questioned a lot about, like, who I was versus, like, how I'm supposed to be, anyways. But yeah, we're we're kind of, like, in a different place now, but Liz, I wanted to get your thoughts. So, like, you talked about that struggle, and then, you mentioned you went to therapy to kind of, like, talk it out and just, like, kind of even learn a little bit about yourself and maybe why. So, like, today, if folks are struggling with this feeling of being like, "Oh, can I show feelings? Is it okay to show feelings?" Like, how would you say they need to think about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's actually pretty different for each person. And it depends on, I would say, two main things, but many other things. So, one is the context in which you work. So, every workplace has what researchers call an emotional culture. And this is, company culture is something most of us have heard of. I live in San Francisco. So, here it's move fast and break things, is often something people say. And that's usually made very explicit. It's often a company value and it guides our decision making. So if I'm thinking about should I rush on this project or product, move fast and break things can help me make that decision. An emotional culture is usually unspoken. And it's when I show up to a meeting, whether it's in person or virtual, are people speaking over each other? Is one person dominating the conversation? What are people sharing about their personal lives? What emotions are they showing? And that will really, really impact what I feel safe expressing as well. And so I do think, there are differences in workplaces. Google, for example, a tech company that's very progressive and where people maybe skew younger, you have more Gen Z in the workplace who tend to be more emotionally expressive. That's a place where you might share more than if you work at a white glove investment bank, where it's still going to be a little more buttoned up. And so there are things that sort of the fundamentals of what make teams and managers and leaders successful are the same in both, but those things might show up differently. The other thing that varies across people is your emotional expression tendency. So, speaking about our childhoods,
Mhm.
we all kind of sit on a spectrum. So, some of us are under emoters, so we just don't express that much emotion naturally. And that's often a product of how we were raised. It can also be what we learned was safe to express. So, men sometimes learned it was safe to express anger, but it was not safe to express joy or to cry. And
Mhm.
again, these are like very rigid gender roles that I'm talking about, but they do affect often how people are socialized or how they feel they need to show up. So some of us are under emoters, some of us are over emoters. So this is also cultural. Again, Southern Europe, Italians tend to be. I had a friend when I went to college who was Italian, and me coming from this Northern European background, like he would sort of like kiss you on both cheeks. And I was like, I need you to stand at least 5 feet away from me all times. Like, this is so different than what I'm used to. So it was a big cultural difference. And so there's not good or bad, right? It's just, and you can be authentic. It's just knowing where you sit on that and sometimes making adjustments because the best leaders do act as even emoters. So if you're an under emoter, the safest emotions to lean into in the workplace are gratitude and praise. So if your team has done something really well, kind of saying more than you might feel comfortable saying, like expressing that, like, I'm so excited for you. I'm so proud of what this team has done. If you're an over emoter, on days when you're having a bad day, pausing, giving yourself some more space just to make sure you're not letting that bad moment or frustration poison every single one of your interactions. Again, because you are just more likely to wear your heart on your sleeve to show exactly what you're feeling inside. So I think there's not like a really succinct one size fits all. I think some of it is understanding the environment in which you're operating and then also understanding your natural tendency. And you don't need a personality transplant. If you're an under emoter, you don't suddenly need to be like saying everything that's going on within you. But it is understanding in some situations when you want to make small adjustments just to have a personal connection and be a leader that people want to follow.
I love that, and I love how you kind of broke it down in that, yes, part of it is, like, yourself, but also understanding the environment that you're in, and you're
Mhm.
saying how in some industries, it is totally okay to be very expressive, but in more, like, buttoned up formal industries, you kinda have to be a little bit more, like, thoughtful of, like, but you also said as an individual, there's this, like, you said under emoter and
Mhm.
over emoters, and I think you broke down how, and I think some of us can self-identify of like, where do we fall in this spectrum? You're like, I'm definitely under motor or over motor, right? But like just kind of knowing where you tend to fall. And I would even imagine like a lot of that is dependent on maybe even who you're around too.
Totally. Yeah.
If you're around folks that you are super comfortable with, and of course being more emotional and showing all that probably is very easy. Or then when you're in a meeting with a bunch of senior leaders, you're like, ooh, then I have to not it's just, it's
Mhm.
very interesting how like there's so many factors that are constantly at play at work that affect how we communicate, how we show up, which is why I love talking about this topic of communications and even in feelings and emotions, because it's not something that I think we think about very often. And I love the tips that you shared, Liz, in terms of like depending on where you fall, these are some things you can do.
Mhm.
So, one of the things that I wanted to also ask you was because you talked about how a lot of times people are talking about uncertainty in the
Mhm.
workplace, and uncertainty can, of course, evoke a lot of emotions of anxiety, stress. Am I going to have my job? Like, is everything safe? Right. And I think that from a manager's point of view, that could also, you might be getting questions from your team of like, is everything okay? But anyways, if that's the current environment of like uncertainty on the team or even at work, how does one navigate their emotions, and even like how do you even communicate like your feelings about it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that's come up a lot over the last year, in particular. So I would say when it comes to uncertainty, the first thing is not to beat yourself up if you feel stressed or overwhelmed. There is a lot of research that shows that humans fundamentally do not like uncertainty. So there's one study that even shows we would rather know for sure that something bad is going to happen tomorrow than have a 50% chance of something bad happening tomorrow. When we know something will happen guaranteed, we can plan for it, we can prepare ourselves, we feel somewhat in control, even if it's not necessarily true. But if we have a 50% chance or a 33% chance of that bad thing happening, suddenly we have to prepare for multiple scenarios. And that is exhausting. Your brain zigs and zags through different options and what would I do here? What would I do there? And so it's so much more work. And that is why it is inherently more stressful not to feel like you know what's going to happen in the next day or week or month. So it's a very normal response to stressful stimuli. So I think that's the first thing is just not putting pressure on yourself to feel totally fine when the future feels up in the air. For individuals, I would say we also tend to put unreasonable expectations on ourselves. And so this phrase that I found really powerful is I'm an individual learning to, or I'm a person learning to. So let's say that you just got promoted. Instead of thinking, I need to be the world's most amazing manager on day one, which is just not a reasonable expectation, saying, I'm a person learning to grow into this new role. And what that does is it gives you, allows you to give yourself grace, but it also shifts your mindset from being this very sort of like, I need to do everything perfectly on day one to asking for feedback, asking your own manager to help you, reading books, taking courses, whatever it might be, which is ultimately going to help you perform better than, again, putting so much pressure on yourself. This is also a useful phrase for teams. So managers can say, we are a team learning to navigate these shifting priorities. Maybe there was a reorganization. So we're a team that's learning how to work together for the first time because some of us are new. And again, I think that just puts people in a better mindset. The last thing I'll say on uncertainty is for people, both managers and individuals, to stop doing something that we commonly do called anxious fixing. So,
Mhm.
anxious fixing is you wake up in the morning, you feel anxious, and instead of sitting with that challenging emotion, which is uncomfortable, and trying to figure out what's driving it and what you can do to address that need, you just start doing stuff. And this is really bad when managers do it. This is probably if you're, reporting to someone and you suddenly start getting messages and emails and all this frantic energy from them, it's because they're anxious fixing. They're nervous about something, there's something coming up, and they just like want to feel in control as opposed to saying, okay, there's this really looming impending deadline. I'm worried we won't hit it. Let's get together as a team. What is non essential that we can cut from the project plan? do we need to cancel some meetings later in the week to make sure we have enough heads down time? That is really addressing the root of your anxiety and uncertainty versus just suddenly spinning out a million other projects. Often people will like obsessively clean their apartments. And again, there's nothing wrong with cleaning your apartment. But if what you're doing is just avoiding the problem, you're actually going to burn yourself out without ever addressing the root cause of what's bothering you. So I think it's just like sitting, acknowledging your emotions, understanding where they're coming from, and then taking action on that versus spinning up a bunch of other stuff that's not actually that helpful in the long run.
I remember for me early on in my career, I think I tend to be very sensitive, and I remember even early on in my career, for example, my manager might say something to me, and it might just be, like, the most, like, benign comment, but I would just, like, sit with it and
Mhm.
dwell on it and just, like, almost in my mind, like, go through all these, like, scenarios of, like, "Did he say that because of this? Did he say that because of that?" And I remember always feeling how I actually used to always wonder, like, "Do other people, like, do this?" Like, I
Yes,
feel like there's
can
some
confirm it too.
yeah, I just know that there's some people who literally can just let things, like, slide off their
Mhm,
shoulders, like, no big deal, but I think it's just because I was, like, very hypersensitive and maybe and I talk about this a little bit in my book coming out, but it's like so growing up in a very conservative home, like, this idea of, like, power distance and, like, deference
mhm,
to authority, like, that was very much, like, how I was raised. Like, if a senior leader said something to me, it's absolutely, like it's, like, the thing, you know?
mhm,
So, even just, like, a casual comment that my manager might say to me, and it might not even have been, like, a bad thing, I would take it and analyze it and be like, "What is this? What is he or she trying to say?" And I think a part of it was, like, I had to learn in the working world that, like, dwelling on anything is probably, like, the least productive thing that
mhm,
we can do for ourselves, and it's, like, kinda like what you said. It's, like, just acknowledging maybe the anxiety that came from somebody's comment, but then not just, like, sitting on it, but then kind of, like, taking action and
mhm,
just moving forward. And even now, I feel like I've gotten a lot better in terms of, like, if somebody says something, like, not so nice, instead of feeling, like, so terrible about it, I'd be like, "It's okay, just kind of move on," right? And just
mhm.
figure out the steps we need to take. So I absolutely love that. Um, why do you think, Liz, that emotions is tends to have, like, a negative connotation, like, at work, like, as if it's, like, not welcomed in the workplace?
Yeah, it's funny. I think it has a negative connotation at work because it wasn't welcomed in the workplace for so long. And so, what that meant is that the only emotional expression that we often encountered at work was these big bursts of frustration of, someone slamming the notebook or slamming the door or someone like bursting into tears, which I would say isn't that bad. But it is a very big expression of emotion that sometimes people don't know how to handle. And again, I think those moments arise because we never had the tools or the opportunities to work through small issues in the beginning when they're still small. And so they fester and fester and fester. And then suddenly you have these years long resentments or crying. There's interesting research around crying, especially when it comes to women or people who identify as women, where I think the belief is often people cry because they're sad, but women overwhelmingly say, "I cry at work because I'm frustrated, because I feel like no one has heard me, and this is like my last no one is getting what I'm saying." And that's because, again, there's no structures in place. Like you've said, we don't think about emotions. There's not moments built into the workday where we can actually raise issues or ask questions or flag problems or say, "Hey, I think this might have been a miscommunication." And so I think as we become more comfortable with those things, as we put more processes in place, and this does not have to be a big top down initiative. This can be in a one on one, a manager just saying, "How's your week going? What can I do to support you? What's been challenging? What's blocking your work? What do you feel like I'm not hearing?" Some of these questions, making those standard practice in every weekly one on one, those are opportunities. You create space for someone to bring forward the issues that might be bothering them and also standing in the way of their performance or progress. And then you're actually less likely to end up with someone who's extremely frustrated and cries or lashes out at someone else because you've actually addressed the problem before it became this bigger issue. So I think it's kind of an ironic thing that because we were so reluctant to allow emotions in the workplace, emotions are data. We evolved to have them. Many, many years ago, if you saw a lion running towards you and you did not feel fear, which would motivate you to run away, you would be eaten by the lion. And so it's like so important that you have emotions. And so I think it's useful to start to remember that having an emotion is not the same thing as acting on it. So you can sit with it, learn what it's telling you, and take a useful step forward in a way that doesn't burden people around you or doesn't harm anyone around you. And so I think that's another misconception, is this idea that if you have emotions, that means you're acting in these really irrational ways. When in fact, we all have emotions and they can be really important signals as to what we should do next or what we might want to decide.
It makes me think of like one of the communication strategies that I often teach about, communicating in the workplace and communicating with your team and manager. And it's almost being like, there's so much power in being proactive and even sharing with folks. I'm feeling really frustrated right now. And just
Mhm.
saying those words, or I'm feeling really anxious about this upcoming presentation with the
Mhm.
leadership team, and you telling someone that. So almost instead of bottling it up basically and feeling like you have to manage it yourself or deal with it yourself, sharing that feeling with folks on your team, your manager, and say like, yeah, I'm feeling pretty anxious about this. And sometimes I feel like when you open up yourself to sharing that feeling, a lot of times people actually jump in and they'd be like, well, is there anything I can do to help you? Right. Or
Mhm.
is there anything I can do to take off your plate? Or can we maybe adjust that deadline for you so you can have more time to work on this, because I know you might be feeling a bit anxious. So I feel like there's a sense of, when you are proactive about expressing your emotions and not waiting until it blows up and you're just like,
Mhm.
ah, and you're like, and when it feels like it's too late now, it's almost like kind of looping people into the process of
Mhm.
how you're feeling. I feel like that can help a lot.
Totally. Yeah. That's advice I share a lot with people. And then I would also encourage, I think there's to get even farther with that, is to both name that you're feeling anxious and then give your manager or your colleague a really clear way to help you. So, and that requires doing a little bit of additional internal work of saying, there's this presentation coming up. I'm feeling really anxious. Here's everything on my plate right now. Can you help me prioritize so that I'm making sure that I'm still getting everything that's important done, but that I also have enough time to work on this presentation? Or I'm feeling anxious about this presentation. You're an amazing presenter. Can you watch the first 5 minutes and give me some tips? I think that's because often people do want to help, but they just are stretched in so many different directions, especially managers. There's so much on their plate. So if you can do the additional work of thinking through, what could this person do that would really alleviate my anxiety and also doesn't take up their whole week, I think as a manager, that's always really impressive to me when someone comes and they say, I'm feeling overwhelmed. Here's something you can do as my manager to help me grapple with that or to help me feel better or make progress. And I will just instantly be like, that's a really good way to handle this. I'm glad you flagged this. And I'm more than happy to take action. So, yes, I love that. And would add, if you could give someone a really tangible next step, I think you will usually find that they are more than happy to help you.
I think this is probably one of the best tips that I think is so important. It's being proactive and sharing how you're feeling, whatever that feeling is, but not just being like, I feel this way, but
Mhm.
saying like, but here are some things that I think, can we talk about so we can maybe, yeah, readjust, rearrange. And when you offer solutions, multiple solutions as options, I think you're right, Liz. I think folks generally are receptive to being like, okay, let's see what we can maybe like, push back. And I think then that can reduce a lot of that, feeling that we're talking
Mhm.
about. So one of the questions I do want to also ask in
Mhm.
regards to this is that feeling of, okay, our manager pulls us into a meeting and we're
Mhm.
like, "Oh my god, did I do something wrong?" Like, I'm the kind of
Mhm.
person who tends to
Mhm.
default to, like, "Did I do something wrong?" Like, I just jump
Mhm.
to, like, the worst conclusions. So, if that ever happens where, your manager wants to schedule a meeting or you're engaging in a tricky conversation where emotions are starting to get high, people are starting to get defensive,
Mhm.
how do we communicate? What do we do in a situation like that?
Yeah, great question. So the first is, I think, especially if you know that you're a catastrophizer, um, trying to nip that in the bud. And it's funny when I talk about uncertainty or feeling stressed ahead of some big event or something, people have often said that what helps them is asking themselves, what's the worst thing that could happen? And that has never helped me because I can think of like extremely terrible things. So that only increases my anxiety because I'm very creative when it comes to that. So what I have found is helpful is like, what's the best thing that could happen? What's the most likely thing that will happen? And how can I prepare for that? And that sort of counteracts this like, what's the worst thing, which I'm usually focused on anyway. And also, I think often we don't ever think about like, this could be an opportunity. What is the best thing? So first, making sure that you're not going in already primed to assume that the worst has happened. I think when you find tensions are getting high, there's two tips. One is actually taking a break. And so that can be, ideally, that might be, hey, why don't we just come back to this tomorrow? Like, let's all think through it. Maybe we can async, like, start to write out some of our thoughts on this. But it seems like, we're all just feeling the stress. And so let's find time tomorrow to come back to this after we've all been able to sleep on it. You can't always do that. And so, one thing I saw my friend do at a dinner, someone said something that she found offensive. And I thought she just did such a lovely job of creating space for herself to think about what she wanted to say next. And she just raised her hand a little like this and she said, I'm having a strong reaction to your words and I need a moment. And so it was just like immediately flagged what happened was not okay. But she also showed that she was trying not to just react and instead think of a response. And then she ended up, they had a great conversation. I think it was because she created that space for herself, not just to immediately lean into whatever her emotional response might be. Um, and the other thing I'll say is really trying to keep, if there's a disagreement, if there's a very emotionally fraught conversation in the workplace, trying to keep it focused on the work versus on the person or on a specific behavior versus making generalizations. So let's say someone interrupts me in a meeting. It's going to be much more productive if I go to them and I say, hey, when you interrupted me, it made me feel like I wasn't valued or like you didn't want to include me in the conversation. And then just stop and see what their perspective is, have a conversation from there versus if I go in hot and I say, you are a rude person. How could you do that to me? Right? Like they're going to come up with a million times in their life when they were not a rude person. It just doesn't start the conversation off on the right foot. So, as much as possible, trying to anchor your feedback or anchor the conversation on like the work, which people take less personally, or on a specific moment where it's again harder to come up with a billion reasons why you're not rude or you're not a mean person or things like that. So I think it's those are some tips too of just like making sure you're not making assumptions and generalizations.
So many golden nuggets. That's what I always like to call, like, whenever my guest says, like, an amazing thing, I'm like, "That's a golden nugget." So, I would even add to that because I think back to, like, how do I deal, like, whenever I'm in a tricky conversation. I have
Mhm.
found a lot of times it's sometimes we can notice, like, when it's happening, right? Like, whether it's, like, we're getting defensive, somebody else is getting defensive, and it's like it takes, like you can tell the conversation has shifted a little bit,
Mhm.
right? Without anybody really needing to say it. And I have found what has helped for me is even just kind of being like, "Wait a second," like, almost, like, detaching myself and being like,
Mhm.
"Let me just, like, look at this from a bird's eye view," and
Mhm.
almost kind of, like, letting myself I know this is so silly. It's like letting myself, like, float up and, like, look
Mhm.
at both me and the person sitting in this room right now and just being like, "Wait a second." Like, again, it's taking that, like, because I think sometimes with emotions, especially with tricky conversations, it's that you're heated, you're in
Yeah.
that moment, you cannot see clearly, right? So for me, when I notice like maybe somebody else is getting angry or I'm starting to like, "Ooh," I'm like, "Ooh," right? Instead
Mhm.
of like, just jumping into it and being like, "Okay." And this is all like mentally, right? It's not like anything that anybody's saying, but it's just kind of like maybe as a person's talking in your mind, you're like, whoa, okay, it's definitely going a different direction right now. Let me just kind of like take a few steps back. And in my mind, I'm like visualizing me
Mhm.
and the person sitting there, like as if I'm watching us talk. And I feel like that has diffused a lot of like, those quick anger moments. Cause like, and you know what I mean, right? It's like when people say something and it's not necessarily what they mean. And then it just turns into like a whole bigger thing, right?
Yeah,
So
totally.
how can we avoid situations like that? What I've also found that can also make conversations that are turning a bit heated is
Mhm.
sometimes just like a lot of times I notice people just want to feel acknowledged a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Like, and just saying those words like, okay, like I hear what you're saying. And even saying those words, I know it can be so hard because maybe you're not
Mhm.
feeling happy either, right? But
Mhm.
I have found that a tricky conversation, a heated conversation can be made a lot less tricky and heated if we sometimes even say those words. I
Mhm.
hear what you're saying. I understand what you're saying, right? And just
Mhm.
starting your sentence, like just starting your sentence with that, I think can make the other person feel like, okay, well, at least Jessica heard me or, whatever.
Yeah, I love that. I think also because when we're in an emotionally heightened state, I think we often focus so much on what we want to say next that we actually don't hear the other person. Or we've made an assumption that might not be true, but we're now clinging to that assumption and we're not allowing the other person to potentially prove that that assumption was wrong. So, one of the things I always say is your feelings aren't facts. Your feeling is absolutely valid. You're feeling it, but it might be based on something you decided about the other person or your interpretation of their words of an event when actually they intended something totally different. And so I love that. I think saying like I'm hearing what you're saying and even repeating back to them because it forces you to actually hear what they're saying, which is something that we actually don't tend to do, especially when we're just in the heat of the moment and angry and we just want to say what we want to say. I love that. I think it's really valuable to do that with someone.
That is a tip that and it even goes beyond work, right? Like, if it's, like,
Mhm.
your
Yeah.
partner, your husband, or wife, like, trust me, like and unfortunately, I don't have too many, like, tricky or heated conversations in the workplace, but I do think
Mhm.
about, when I'm talking to my husband and,
Mhm.
like, because he tends to, like, have a lot of feelings and stuff, and for me, I know, like and that's the thing, it's like, I know that he has a lot of thoughts and feelings about things that it helps me and my husband's communications when I say those words, like, "I hear what you're saying, I
Mhm.
understand," or like, I feel like that has helped our conversations, our
Totally.
communications a
Yeah.
lot too.
It's funny how many work tips actually work really well in your personal life too.
I always joke how, because I teach communications and it's what I
Mhm.
specialize in many ways, I think the reason why I've always been so fascinated with it was because it's always something that I've wanted to learn myself.
Mm.
Maybe because growing up, right? I just felt like I never learned good communication
Mhm.
skills in my home environment that when I started working, I realized it all really does come down to being able to articulate your feelings, being able to
Mhm.
articulate your thoughts.
Mhm.
And I think that's why I've become like this is like what I study, this is what I teach now. I don't know that's kind of probably a similar path to you, right, Liz? You're like I really want to understand feelings cuz it wasn't so much in my childhood.
Totally, and it's also, it's I think it's an interesting space to be in because there are so many dynamics that are individual, that are unique to a workplace, and also they're changing, right? Like younger generation. I'm a millennial, and I will say, even I sometimes when I'm around Gen Zers who have just entered the workplace, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is a lot of emotion. And 5 years ago, I was the one that was the on the far end of emotional expression. And I think that's very cool. It's interesting to see these changes and the shifts, and to learn both from older generations and younger, and kind of see like what can you take from each and what makes for a really great work experience.
So I can't believe this, but we're about to wrap up here. And I've so much enjoyed this conversation. We've had such a great turnout of folks who joined us the entire time. And for those who are listening, I hope you're enjoying this. So as we wrap up, Liz, what is that one last thing that you'd want folks to walk away with, given our topic about, harnessing, the power of emotions
Mhm.
at work?
I think it sounds basic, but people still struggle with it, including myself, which is not judging yourself for feeling an emotion, but rather trying to understand the value in what it's telling you. Envy is a great example. I think we're often taught don't be envious, don't be jealous, squash that emotion. But it usually is an indication that someone has something you want. And so they might be a great mentor. It might be, oh, wow, this person's job, maybe that's something that I want to apply for in my next role. So, again, just an example of even these emotions we label as bad or negative, they certainly can feel challenging and feel really difficult, but there's still usually valuable information in there if we allow ourselves to tune into it.
I love that. So it's not so much ignoring it, suppressing it, it's
Mhm.
acknowledging it and trying to understand, like, where is it coming from? Why is it happening? Because yeah, I think for many of us, we just weren't taught, and a lot of it takes time, right? To be like, okay, let me like try to like almost like psychoanalyze like what is going on. But I do agree, just giving ourselves even that permission to do that, we can uncover a lot about ourselves. And your example about envy too, which is of
Mhm.
course another emotion we didn't talk too much about today. I think instead of feeling like the negative feelings of envy, being like, wait a second, maybe this is a clue of like that's something that I desire. And then instead of being like, well, this sucks because I don't have it, it's like, what can I do to maybe try to like achieve that,
Mhm.
acquire that, whether it's reaching out to that person or putting the steps in place to get it. So
Mhm.
I
Exactly.
I love that. So, I would say my one kind of like last thing that I hope everybody would walk away with is just kind of like that one tip that Liz and I share. I mean, I know we talked about a lot of things, and I know with these conversations, like, oh my gosh, but the one thing is kind of like knowing that I think being proactive in our communications
Mhm.
can really alleviate a lot of like, things becoming worse than, it needs to be. Like, even expressing calmly, like, I'm feeling this way and saying that and knowing it's 100% okay. And then kind of like then what you said, Liz, is like, well, I'm feeling this sort of way. It doesn't feel great, but let me try to say this to my manager, for example, and offer solutions on how they can help me. I just think tips like this is the stuff that I wish I learned, when I
Same. Yeah,
early
totally same.
early on in my career instead of like me feeling like I have to like run to the bathroom and start crying because I'm
Mhm.
frustrated. It's more knowing that there are strategies, there's techniques, there's ways to manage it. And hey, Liz, it's all in your book, right?
There you go, and yeah, probably some of it in your book as well that comes out later this year.
Yes. Okay, Liz. So if folks want to get in contact with you, how can they do that?
LinkedIn is great, or I would say, yeah, just LinkedIn is the best place to get in contact with me.
Sounds good. So if you all are not connected with Liz already, be sure to connect with her on LinkedIn. And same, if we're not already connected here on LinkedIn, be sure to add me. Feel free to even like message me and just, let me know that you're here at this event. It's a great way for me to kind of get to know you as well. So we host these Soulcast Media Live events every other week and I always have a fantastic guest on such as Liz, and we talk all things communications, career, and just ways to accelerate your growth. Most of the time announce our upcoming events on LinkedIn, but if you really want to kind of stay in the loop with us, there's a QR code here on the screen, and that QR code will basically allow you to get notified of all our events. And of course, if there's a topic that interests you, RSVP, or hey, if you have a topic that you're like, Jessica, can we do the topic on this? You can also email us and we will kind of book that mark in and we'll create something. And this is the reason why we do this. It's an opportunity for us to think about career communications, accelerating our career that hopefully is casual, it's fun, and it's just a fun thing to kind of listen and watch. So, with that, I just want to say, Liz, thank you so much for joining us. I had such a great time just learning from you and just all the tips on emotions at work. And for those of you who joined, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And I look forward to seeing you all. We have another one coming up in 2 weeks, all about job search. So if that's something that interests you, be sure to RSVP. And again, the QR code for that is on the screen. So thank you so much, Liz.
Thanks for
Take care,
having me. Bye,
everybody.
everyone.